In 1137, the fate of the life of Eleanor of Aquitaine was decided. The 13-year-old lost her father within a few weeks, had to marry the French Crown Prince Louis, and was crowned Queen of France just days later. What followed was a life that had it all. She was to have a total of 10 children, divorce, marry the future King of England, go on a crusade, act as regent several times, and even be in command of military conflicts. She was the founder of the Plantagenet dynasty on the English throne with Henry II. But their descendants were also to rule on the continent. She is therefore considered the grandmother of Europe. If you ask about the most powerful woman of the Middle Ages, you will usually always get the answer, Eleanor of Aquitaine. Recently, however, historians have pointed out that it was much less unique than it seems. This does not take anything away from their achievements, but puts them in context. That's what we'll talk about at the end of this video, as well as the sad fate of their bones. Welcome back to Lemmy History. This is a project I wanted to realize for such a long time. I narrate in my own voice, but I will use AI voices for the dialogues. All dialogues are based on primary sources, but I modernized the language. From time to time, I combined quotes from several sources to ensure the clarity of the lines. But now let's get to it. Eleanor as a woman already moved the imagination of her contemporaries. Numerous songs were written about her. Many were flattering and praised her beauty. Quite a few of the plays revolved around adult fantasies. Eleanor, for example, appears in Carmina Burana as the praiseworthy Queen England, and Benoit de Saint-Maur describes her in Roman de Troyes as the Queen of Beauty and Largesse. Many songs were written by people they had never seen, and only heard stories about them that fired their imaginations. Almost ironically, we are not dissimilar. No contemporary of Eleanor wrote a biography of the Queen of Two Lands and the Duchess of the largest duchy of France. We have very few sources about them. When she is mentioned, her beauty is often the only positive thing the chroniclers have to say. Eleanor otherwise receives a lot of reprimand because she did not correspond to the ideal of a woman of her time. A quote from her biography, written by the Chinon Castle team, succinctly sums up the reason for this. Eleanor learned very early to give orders and not to receive them in order to govern in a world of men. Reducing her to her outward appearances was an attempt to make her deeds as queen, regent, and duchess forgotten. The attempt alone shows that the chroniclers themselves did not understand who they were dealing with. Eleanor was capable of strategic thinking to an extent that surprised many powerful people again and again, and presented them with insoluble problems. Even when she betrayed Henry II, and he wanted to get rid of her, this was to become apparent. Or to let Eleanor say it herself.
I know what is mine, and I know how to defend it.
To understand this, we need to start at the very beginning. Eleanor was most likely born in 1124. For a long time, historians considered 1122 to be her birth year, based on her wedding date in 1137. However, this assessment has been revised in recent years. The key piece of evidence comes from a 13th century genealogy, which states that she was 13, not 15, at the time of her father's death, an age that would have been more typical for marriage at the time. Despite this correction, the year 1122 is still widely cited, though it lacks solid historical backing. Eleanor first appears in recorded sources in July 1129. Anything before that remains unknown, though we do have information about her family. She was the daughter of William and Eleanor, and her name likely originated from the Latin phrase alia Eleanor, meaning the other Eleanor. From this, Eleanor evolved. No fixed spelling of her name has survived. Her grandfather, William IX, Duke of Aquitaine, was renowned both as a troubadour and a warrior. His first marriage to Philippa of Toulouse granted Eleanor a claim to that county, an issue that would resurface multiple times in her life. Eleanor's father, William X, initially supported the anti-pope Anacletus, but a meeting with Bernard of Clairvaux reportedly led to his conversion, convincing him to recognize Pope Innocent II instead. This decision carried lasting consequences. Bernard never forgot the family's original alliance with the anti-pope, and given his history of performing exorcisms on women, He would remain deeply suspicious of Eleanor throughout her life. Eleanor was educated in Latin and Provençal, the language of Aquitaine. This has often been interpreted as a sign that she was not only chosen as a future bride at an early age, but also prepared to rule independently. Supporting this idea is the fact that she was her parents' eldest child. She had a younger sister, known in history as Petronilla, and a brother, also named William. Eleanor's mother was the daughter of one of her grandfather's mistresses. In other words, William X married the daughter of William IX's lover. This did little to enhance the family's reputation within church circles. In 1127, Eleanor's grandfather died, elevating her father to Duke of Aquitaine. He ruled over a vast territory encompassing 19 modern-day French departments. His exact plans for Eleanor at that time remain unclear, but they were abruptly derailed 3 years later. In 1130, both her mother and younger brother died, leaving Eleanor as the sole heiress to the duchy. This put her in significant danger, as the abduction of wealthy heiresses, who were then forced into marriage, was a common occurrence. The sources don't explicitly mention it, but it seems likely that this was a defining experience for Eleanor. From the age of 7, she would have had to be under constant guard to prevent potential kidnappings. In a cruel twist of fate, she would actually be abducted 2 times by her husbands, but we're not there yet. It remains uncertain when her father first considered marrying her into the French royal family. However, it seems unlikely that he only began contemplating the idea in 1137 and acted on it immediately. As the heir to the largest duchy in France, Eleanor required the highest level of protection, and only the French king could provide it. At the time, the French crown itself was in crisis. The territory directly controlled by the monarchy was smaller than Aquitaine. While the kingdom's dukes were officially vassals of the king and owed him homage, they operated with considerable independence. France was in a near-constant state of internal conflict, what we might now call a civil war. This instability would become even more apparent in the second half of Eleanor's life when, with her help, the English king controlled more of France than the French king himself. Eleanor's father could confidently predict that the French royal family would be highly interested in a marriage between the heir to the throne and his daughter. Aquitaine was a crucial piece in the puzzle of consolidating territorial lordships under the crown's control. This was even more significant given that the royal family was facing both a health crisis and a succession crisis. Louis VI, later known as the Fat, was immortalized in historical depictions that subtly hinted at his corpulence, often showing him standing slightly bent. This was not meant as a negative portrayal, yet the truth was still evident. His health deteriorated significantly in his later years, particularly in 1137. His designated heir, Philip, had died at the age of 15, forcing Louis VI to recall his second son, also named Louis, from the Cathedral School of Saint-Denis in 1131. Young Louis had been raised for an ecclesiastical career and had essentially been living in a monastery. To secure the succession, Louis VI arranged for his son to be crowned King of France by the Pope in 1131. Though the elder Louis retained full control of the government, he ensured that upon his death, there would be a crowned king who had papal support. Now, all that remained was to find the right bride for his son, who had been born in 1120. The fact that he waited 6 years to arrange Louis VII's marriage suggests that he had been interested in an alliance with Aquitaine for some time. However, as long as Eleanor's father supported the antipope, such a union was impossible. In 1136, William X met with Bernard of Clairvaux and was converted, finally opening the door to marriage negotiations. Around the same time, William X also embarked on a military campaign alongside his northern neighbor, Geoffrey of Anjou, a man known for wearing a gorse branch as a helmet ornament. In French, this plant was called plantagenet, which later gave rise to the name Plantagenet. Whether it was this campaign or his encounter with Bernard that influenced him, William soon decided to make a pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela. Before departing, he had all his vassals swear loyalty to Eleanor, ensuring the security of her inheritance. For the journey, he placed his daughters under the protection of the French crown. They traveled with him to Bordeaux, where the archbishop took them in temporarily. However, William never reached his destination. He died just before arriving in Santiago de Compostela. His alleged date of death carried heavy religious significance. He passed away on Good Friday, April 9, 1137. What followed is known primarily from the writings of Abbot Suger of Saint-Denis, who would remain a close confidant of Eleanor and her first husband throughout their lives. In his will, William reportedly requested that the French king find a suitable husband for his eldest daughter. In an act of magnanimity, Louis VI decided to marry Eleanor to his own son. Before the wedding, however, a dramatic power struggle unfolded. In June 1137, the Archbishop of Bordeaux secured a major concession. His ecclesiastical province would be allowed to elect its prelates through canonical elections, and would no longer be required to swear oaths of allegiance to the crown. Effectively, the archbishop blackmailed the monarchy. He would only protect Eleanor from Aquitaine's vassals, who sought to kidnap and forcibly marry the heiress, if he received independence in return. The wedding took place on July 25, 1137, in Bordeaux Cathedral. Eleanor didn't have to wait long to become queen. Just days later, on August 1st, Louis VI died. On Christmas Day, 1137, Louis VII and the Duchess of Aquitaine were crowned King and Queen of France. Before that, however, Louis VII had already undergone a smaller coronation ceremony on August 8th, reaffirming his position as monarch. This sequence of events suggests that not only was Louis VI gravely ill, but so was William X. Eleanor's father sought to cleanse himself of his sins before his death and to secure his daughter's inheritance. Both men likely knew their time was short, and together they staged a carefully planned transition of power. Eleanor's life as queen initially marked a decline in her status and comfort. The Parisian Palais de la Cité was smaller and more austere than the grand palaces she had known in Aquitaine during her childhood and youth. Changes were made swiftly. Louis, who adored his wife from the start and remained faithful to her throughout their marriage, had her chambers enlarged and modernized. However, he himself remained committed to the monastic ideals instilled in him through his education, and was uninterested in such luxuries. Eleanor also introduced several court protocols from her upbringing that were not yet common in the French royal household. These innovations quickly sparked criticism. Some accused the queen of being spoiled, and her expectations were seen as excessive. Eleanor herself later recounted what had caused such an uproar.
I enforced that tablecloths were laid out for meals and napkins were ready. I also instructed all the staff members to wash their hands each time before serving food.
These customs had long been standard in southern France, and under different circumstances, they might have gone unnoticed. However, Eleanor also took the bold step of dismissing the cantor of the chapel of St. Nicholas, believing he was incapable of leading the royal choir effectively. This, more than her reforms, provoked significant backlash. She also brought an extensive entourage to court, whose members dressed elegantly in the fashion of Aquitaine. Bernard of Clairvaux, like many older courtiers who feared losing their influence, frequently denounced such displays as exaggerated luxury. In the first decade of her marriage, Eleanor played little political role. She was primarily seen at ceremonial events, and few royal decrees bore her signature. Meanwhile, the long-awaited pregnancy did not come quickly. This was likely due to her young age. An early pregnancy would have posed serious risks to both her and the child. However, she is believed to have suffered a miscarriage in the late 1130s. By the early 1140s, Eleanor became increasingly focused on her family and inheritance. In 1141, she persuaded her husband to attempt to reclaim Toulouse, which had been ruled by her uncle, Alfonso Jordan, for 20 years. The campaign ended in embarrassment. Louis, for all his virtues, was not a military strategist, a weakness that would plague him throughout his reign. In contrast, Eleanor had far more military knowledge. The failure was largely due to Louis's lack of proper siege equipment. In 1142, Eleanor arranged for her sister Petronilla to marry Raoul of Vermandois. The year before, at just 16, Petronilla had begun an affair with Raoul, a man 35 years her senior. Despite objections from his advisors, Louis supported the marriage. The issue was that Raoul was already married, to a niece of Theobald of Champagne. His marriage was annulled against both his wife's will and that of her powerful uncle, sparking an open rebellion by Theobald against the crown. Louis and Eleanor may have anticipated this conflict. Together they led an army into Champagne, but the campaign took a disastrous turn. In 1143, the royal forces attacked the city of Vitry. Hundreds, perhaps even 1,000, civilians sought refuge in the village church. During the destruction of the city, the church caught fire. Whether it was deliberately set ablaze or a tragic accident remains unclear, but all those inside perished in the flames. From a nearby hill, the king witnessed the horrifying event. Louis never forgot this tragedy. For the rest of his life, he sought to atone for what he saw as an unforgivable sin. He may have even placed blame on Eleanor. She had still not given him a male heir, and it was her sister's marriage that had sparked the conflict with Theobald in the first place. The first issue was resolved in 1145, but not in the way Louis had hoped. That year, Eleanor gave birth to their first child, a daughter named Marie. For the first time, doubts about the legitimacy of their marriage began to surface. The Bishop of Laon argued that the king and queen were too closely related to have married in the first place. Louis was well aware of this issue. He had previously annulled his seneschal's first marriage for the same reason, even though his own ties to Eleanor were even closer. Both were descended from Robert II, making them fourth cousins. For now, however, the matter remained contained, thanks in large part to Abbot Suger, who worked to prevent such discussions from gaining traction. With the mediation of Bernard Suger and the newly appointed Pope Celestine, who had taken office in 1143, Eleanor and Louis were finally compelled to abandon their support for the Queen's sister. At one point, an interdict had even been placed on the ruling couple, which deeply affected Louis in particular. By 1144, there was yet another new pope, Eugene III, who immediately faced a major crisis. On December 24th of that year, the Saracens captured Edessa. One of the Crusader states had fallen. Louis saw his opportunity. He influenced the Pope to call for a new crusade, viewing it as a way to cleanse himself of the sin of Vitry. Eleanor, too, had personal reasons to embark on the campaign. Her uncle, Raymond of Poitiers, ruled the Crusader state of Antioch and was now under threat following the fall of Edessa. Determined to aid him, she and Louis took the cross together, signaling their commitment to the crusade. Soon after, good news arrived from the German lands. King Conrad III agreed to lead an army to the Holy Land as well. However, enthusiasm for the crusade in France was lacking, delaying the expedition's start in 1145. Bernard of Clairvaux stepped in to rally support. He even temporarily made peace with Eleanor for the sake of the cause, and she in turn traveled across the kingdom with 300 noblewomen to promote the crusade. Her own participation was not merely about aiding her uncle. There were concerns that, in Louis's absence, she might attempt to govern as regent, a role the king had intended for Abbot Suger instead. By June 1147, the army was finally ready to depart. The French and German troops planned to unite in the Holy Land. Once again, Eleanor faced harsh criticism for her supposed extravagance. According to her enemies, she brought 300 ladies-in-waiting and a baggage train several miles long. While these claims are impossible to verify, they reflect the resentment she provoked. The army traveled through Constantinople, where the courtly splendor left a lasting impression on Eleanor. She would later introduce elements of Eastern fashion and Byzantine court customs to France. From Byzantium, the army advanced toward Antioch, exposing once again Eleanor's superior military instincts. She accompanied the vanguard, while Louis remained with the rearguard. In the mountainous terrain near Muslim forces, she urged haste, recognizing the dangers of stretching the army into a vulnerable, elongated formation. The soldiers were exhausted but still in motion, easy prey for raiders. Eleanor insisted they press on to Antioch even after nightfall. Louis, however, disagreed. He ordered the army to halt and set up camp. Communication between the king and queen was difficult due to the challenging terrain and prolonged military campaign. Messages did not always reach one another, or if they did, Eleanor may have simply ignored them. As a result, the army was divided. Eleanor and the vanguard reached Antioch safely. Louis, however, endured what was likely the worst night of his life. His camp was attacked by Muslim forces, from whom the future Ottoman Empire would emerge. The Christian army suffered devastating losses. Louis himself survived only by disguising himself as a clergyman, climbing a tree and hiding there. A day later he arrived in Antioch with what remained of his army, only to receive a cold reception. The prince's niece, who had successfully led her forces to safety, was the center of attention, while Louis was largely ignored. Raymond treated him as though he were merely Eleanor's servant. The situation was worsened by private conversations between Eleanor and Raymond, which led to scandalous rumors. It was whispered that their relationship was not merely that of an uncle and niece. Finally, Louis confronted his wife.
Do you have an intimate relationship with Raymond? Is that why I am excluded from so many of your meetings? You can't start such an affair with a close blood relative.
Eleanor was unfazed.
If you are concerned about too close a blood relationship, you might be better off thinking about our marriage first.
For the first time, the rift between them was undeniable. It was also Eleanor who first suggested the possibility of ending their marriage. But before that could happen, tensions escalated further. Raymond, Conrad, Louis, and Eleanor clashed over the next course of action. Eleanor and her uncle urged Louis to focus on reclaiming Edessa, a move that would also allow him to atone for his sins. However, Louis had far grander ambitions. He wanted to conquer Damascus and march onward to Jerusalem. Raymond and Eleanor pleaded with him.
Our army is not in a position to do this. It is too weak, especially after the recent losses.
Louis remained unconvinced and persuaded Conrad to back his plan. In response, Eleanor flatly refused to accompany them, but the king was unmoved. That night, his soldiers seized Eleanor and brought her to him against her will, effectively kidnapping her. Raymond remained in Antioch. Meanwhile, disaster struck. The Christian army laid siege to Damascus, but after only 4 days, heavy losses forced them to abandon the campaign. Louis had lost 90% of his army. With morale shattered, many survivors began planning their return to France. From home, Abbot Suger sent urgent messages urging Louis to come back. He still had no son, and the kingdom could not afford such risks. Yet the king insisted on celebrating Easter in the Holy Land in 1149. He did so, but without further military action against the Saracens. Afterward, the couple finally prepared for their return journey. By now, their separation was unmistakable. Eleanor and Louis traveled on separate ships. The crossing proved treacherous. A storm drove Eleanor's ship off course, at times drifting near the Barbary coast. She eventually landed in Sicily, where agents of Roger II provided her shelter but effectively held her captive. Louis, who had reached Calabria, learned of her situation. After brief negotiations, he secured her release. However, their troubles were not over. Their marital discord had reached the Pope, likely through Suger. Pope Eugene III demanded reconciliation. Louis was quick to agree. Eleanor, however, was reluctant. But when the Pope made it clear that he would not grant an annulment, she had no choice but to comply. One outcome of this temporary reconciliation was the birth of their second daughter. Louis named her Petronilla, likely as a gesture of goodwill toward Eleanor's sister. Yet the underlying issue remained. Louis still had no male heir. He returned from the Crusade humiliated, while Eleanor had openly challenged his authority. The fractures in their marriage could no longer be ignored. Even with all that had happened, the marriage might still have endured, if not for 2 decisive events. First, Abbot Suger died on January 13, 1151. He was the only man equally trusted by both the king and queen, the one figure who had held their marriage together. His death removed a crucial stabilizing force in their relationship. That same year, Normandy welcomed a new duke, Henry, Count of Anjou. He traveled to the royal court to pay formal homage to Louis. Though more than 10 years her junior, the young duke was immediately captivated by the 27-year-old queen. Later, chroniclers Gerald of Wales, Walter Map, and William of Newburgh would unanimously report that an intimate relationship had developed between Henry and Eleanor. For Louis, this was the breaking point. He had finally had enough of his wife, and Eleanor, for her part, had long since grown weary of her husband. Yet one major obstacle stood in the way of their separation. Louis was willing to seek an annulment from the Pope on the grounds of consanguinity, but he had no intention of relinquishing his claim to Aquitaine. However, feudal law was clear. Eleanor had brought the duchy into the marriage as her personal inheritance. While Louis, as her husband, had been permitted to administer it, he had no legal right to confiscate it. As king, he could have attempted to seize it by force, but such a move would have been risky. The nobility scrutinized cases like this with great interest, and Louis was in no position to defy them. Weakened by his feud with Theobald of Champagne, and humiliated by the failure of the Crusade, he lacked the strength to win a war against enraged lords. Presumably, Louis believed he could orchestrate Eleanor's remarriage to a man of his choosing, someone who would remain loyal to him and allow him to retain influence over Aquitaine. After all these years, however, he still failed to understand his wife. When their marriage was finally annulled in the spring of 1152 on the grounds of consanguinity, Eleanor wasted no time. She immediately wrote to Henry of Anjou. The annulment took place on March 21st, 1152. Eleanor knew that once again she was the most desirable kidnapping target in all of France. She needed a husband, not just for protection, but one who would not hinder her own ambitions. Henry, who had a legitimate claim to the English throne, met both of these requirements. Time was of the essence. Immediately after the annulment, Eleanor narrowly escaped 2 kidnapping attempts, surviving only by sheer luck. Acting swiftly, she and Henry were married on May 18, 1152. The ceremony, held at Poitiers Cathedral, was relatively modest, a clear indication of how quickly and urgently everything had to be arranged. Whether the two had already made an agreement to marry as early as 1151, as some historians suggest, remains uncertain. Soon after their wedding, Henry prepared to travel to England to assert his right to inherit the throne, but Louis had other plans. Eleanor had shattered his vision for the future and allied herself with the most powerful nobleman in his realm, second only to the king himself. Furious, Louis attempted to impose his will by force, leading to a military confrontation. Once again, it became evident that Louis was no strategist. Henry crushed the king's forces in a matter of days, forcing him into reconciliation. With Louis subdued, Henry turned his attention to England. There he persuaded King Stephen to name him as heir. Even England's barons, who ruled like warlords at the time, approved of the arrangement. They believed the young nobleman from the continent would be too weak to challenge their authority, making him an ideal puppet king. They knew little of Henry Plantagenet, and even less of his formidable wife, Eleanor. But they would soon learn. By 1154, Henry was crowned King of England, and Eleanor had given birth to a son, an event that must have been particularly bitter for Louis. The boy was named William, though tragically, he would not live past 1156. Stephen passed away in the autumn of 1154. Henry and Eleanor were notified immediately, but due to logistical challenges, they were unable to set out for England until early December. Upon arriving on land, they travelled first to Winchester, where they were welcomed by Archbishop Theobald of Canterbury, who had served as regent in the absence of a king. Together, they proceeded to London, where on December 19th, 1154, Henry and Eleanor were crowned King and Queen of England. Less than a year after losing the French crown, Eleanor found herself seated on another throne. It is worth noting, though it was hardly an issue at the time, that she was even more closely related to Henry than she had been to Louis. Such concerns no longer held weight. The couple immediately set to work, and England's barons quickly realized how gravely they had misjudged Henry. The new king and queen had soldiers, wealth, and powerful alliances. In just a few short years, Henry made it clear to every noble in the land that they now served him. Like Eleanor, Henry frequently traveled to the continent to manage their vast holdings, which flourished under their rule. Their domain expanded into what became known as the Angevin Empire, stretching from Scotland to nearly the Mediterranean. Eleanor often governed as regent in Henry's absence. Yet she did not neglect what was seen as her most vital duty, securing the dynasty's future. Between 1155 and 1158, she bore Henry the Younger, Matilda, Richard, and Geoffrey, each arriving in successive years. In the 1160s, she gave birth to 3 more children, Eleanor, Joanna, and John. From the start, the Queen had a clear favourite, Richard, whom she intended to succeed her as Duke of Aquitaine. She took a particular interest in his upbringing, while Henry, named after his father, was raised to inherit the English throne. In a remarkable twist of fate, young Henry eventually married the daughter of Louis VII's second marriage, bringing the former bride and groom together once more. Eleanor herself reflected on the unpredictability of fate with a particularly fitting remark.
In a world where carpenters get resurrected, everything is possible.
At the weddings of their daughters, Henry gave Eleanor significant freedom, recognizing the value of her extensive European connections. Together, they orchestrated brilliant marital alliances, securing positions for their children at some of Europe's most influential courts, including Castile. Their shrewd marriage diplomacy helped ensure the longevity of the Plantagenet dynasty, which would remain on the English throne until 1485. Eleanor embraced court life in England much as she had in France nearly 2 decades earlier, implementing customs and protocols she had observed on the continent and in Byzantium. For the first time in her life, she had no fear that her husband might squander their achievements on reckless military campaigns. Henry, for his part, had an eye for capable advisors, valuing talent over noble birth, an approach entirely in line with Eleanor's own beliefs. As a woman, she had first-hand experience of the obstacles posed by class and gender prejudices. Though such biases persisted under Henry II, the young and energetic king prioritized results above all else, and for now, everything was going well. However, their good fortune would not last. Dispute over Thomas Becket became the first major rift between Henry and Eleanor. Once Henry's chancellor and closest friend, Becket had been appointed Archbishop of Canterbury at the king's urging. Henry had expected him to remain loyal, but instead, Becket fiercely defended the independence of the church. From 1163 onward, tensions between the two men escalated. At one point, both Henry and Eleanor were even excommunicated. Unlike her husband, the queen sided with the archbishop.
I have repeatedly pushed for reconciliation, but Henry didn't want it.
As history records, the conflict reached a tragic climax. Henry's careless words were misinterpreted as an order by 4 of his knights, who then murdered Becket in cold blood. The news spread like wildfire. Eleanor, back in Aquitaine at the time, refused to offer any support. She had already grown deeply resentful of her husband for other reasons. At the time of her wedding, Eleanor was 30 years old. This had not initially troubled Henry, but as time passed, the age gap and the Queen's numerous pregnancies led the king to seek pleasure elsewhere. He took many mistresses, the most famous being Rosamond Clifford. She died young, though over a century later. Baseless rumors arose that Eleanor had poisoned her out of jealousy. This marked the beginning of a recurring pattern in English history. Whenever a sudden death occurred, accusations of poisoning followed. Beyond his infidelities, Henry also began sidelining Eleanor politically. Their disagreement over Becket was just one example. A king reluctant to delegate power, Henry distanced himself from his wife, reducing her role to that of a ceremonial figure and once again, expecting her to bear more children. Eleanor had once dominated her marriage to Louis VII so thoroughly that his only recourse had been to have her seized by his men, yet their relationship had ultimately collapsed, despite brief periods of reconciliation. Eleanor may have believed that she similarly influenced her younger second husband. Now she realized the painful truth: she never had. Henry had kept her out of major decisions, allowing her to believe she had influence only when she happened to agree with him. Whenever she did not, he ignored her. Due to frequent pregnancies, she was often unable to participate in governance, and had failed to notice how little power she truly held. Henry's biographer, Wilfred Lewis Warren, offered a damning assessment of Eleanor's role in her husband's reign. To judge from the chroniclers, the most striking fact about Eleanor is her utter insignificance in Henry II's reign. After the birth of John, Eleanor's childbearing years came to an end. She decided to withdraw to Aquitaine, where she ruled independently, taking Richard with her to prepare him for his future role as duke. Henry sent a trusted confidant to oversee affairs in his interest, but when this man fell in battle soon after, Eleanor was left unchallenged as the head of the duchy. It was said that she built a court of poets and musicians, the legendary Court of Love, but this was a later invention. A far graver matter was at hand. Eleanor soon discovered a bitter betrayal. Henry had secretly pawned parts of Aquitaine to finance his military campaigns. Legally, he had no right to do so. The duchy was her property. He was merely allowed to administer it as her husband. Furious, Eleanor retaliated by having Henry's name removed from all new official documents, issuing them solely in her own name. At times, Richard's name appeared alongside hers. Richard was still too young to marry, and Eleanor hoped to use their time in Aquitaine to find him a suitable bride. But once again she clashed with Henry, who was determined to control the matter himself. As a result, Richard did not marry until years after his father's death. This struggle further deepened Richard's resentment toward Henry. He was not alone. His elder brother, Henry the young king, crowned in 1170 but given no real power, also grew disillusioned, as did their brother Geoffrey. All three sons complained that their father kept them financially dependent and refused to grant them meaningful responsibilities. With the exception of Richard, who was guided by Eleanor, the others accomplished little. Henry II, ever paranoid about potential rivals, saw no reason to empower his own sons if he could prevent it. Sensing an opportunity, Louis VII, father-in-law to Henry the young king, encouraged the growing discontent. He convinced his son-in-law that he should not have to wait for his father's death to wield power. Richard and Geoffrey agreed, while John was still too young to take part. In 1173, the so-called Revolt of the Sons erupted with the support of the French crown. The timing seemed ideal, as Henry II was still politically wounded by Becket's murder. Eleanor, too, sided with her sons. For Louis, who by now had finally secured a long-awaited son, Philip Augustus, with his third wife, Adele of Champagne, this must have been particularly satisfying. However, the rebellion was short-lived. Eleanor, her sons, and Louis had underestimated Henry. In July 1174, the king staged a dramatic act of penance at Canterbury, where he was nearly whipped to death by monks. This not only helped repair his reputation after Becket's murder, but also strengthened his position. Militarily, he remained vastly superior. His sons had little experience as commanders. Louis had always been an incompetent strategist, and Eleanor could not lead an army in the field herself. Henry crushed the rebellion within months. His forces moved so swiftly that they even caught Eleanor off guard. Attempting a desperate escape to Louis in Paris under the cover of night, she was intercepted by Henry's troops. For most of her life, Eleanor had lived under the constant threat of abduction. Now, for the second time, she was kidnapped, this time by her own husband's soldiers. They delivered her to the king, who was undoubtedly on the verge of killing her with his own hands. He forgave his sons, granting them clemency in a formal ceremony after their surrender. But Eleanor's betrayal was, in his eyes, beyond forgiveness. From that moment on, she was placed under house arrest, where she would remain for the rest of his life. We know far less about Eleanor's house arrest than we would like. It was likely not a harsh imprisonment, but she was under constant surveillance. She was completely cut off from the public unless Henry chose to present her at high-profile ceremonies. Held captive in various locations, she is believed to have spent most of her time at Old Sarum, near present-day Salisbury, just 10 kilometers from Stonehenge. Henry was determined to keep her away from the continent, where she had too many powerful allies. The king even petitioned the Pope to annul their marriage. However, the request was denied. The Pope reminded Henry that, given his already tarnished reputation with the Church, especially after Becket's murder, he would be wise not to push his luck. The implication was clear. The Vatican did not want to one day hear that Eleanor had been found dead. The risk of such an outcome would have been dangerously high if their marriage had been dissolved. Henry and Eleanor's sons also opposed an annulment. A new marriage could lead to new sons, threatening their place in the line of succession. Having already been forced to accept next to nothing after their failed rebellion, they knew their inheritance was precarious, and disputes over its division had already begun. Richard, in particular, grew more estranged from Henry. Determined never to find himself so powerless on the battlefield again, he immersed himself in military training in France. Then, in 1183, fate struck. Henry the young king died on June 1st. The king's reaction to his son's passing is still recorded today.
"He cost me much, but I wish he had lived to cost me more."
Shortly before his death, Henry the Younger had pleaded for Eleanor's release. Though Henry II never truly relented, in 1184, he did order a significant easing of her confinement. With his eldest son gone, the logical choice for heir was now Richard. But Henry hesitated. He distrusted Eleanor's favoured son, and had another possible successor in mind, Geoffrey. Though younger by only a year, Geoffrey had already secured the future of the dynasty. He was married to Constance, Duchess of Brittany, and she was expecting a child. The couple had already 2 daughters, Eleanor and Matilde, but if Constance bore a son, Geoffrey would be a stronger candidate for the throne in Henry's eyes. As history records, Constance did give birth to a son, Arthur. But by the time of his birth, Geoffrey was already dead. He was trampled by a horse during a tournament in Paris in August 1186. Though Eleanor, still under house arrest, was informed of her son's death, she was otherwise kept in the dark about most events. It is important to note that she never saw Arthur. With Geoffrey gone, Henry had no choice but to name Richard as his heir. However, by then, John was 19 years old, and Henry saw an opportunity to delay the decision further. He openly entertained the idea of making John his successor instead. John, for his part, remained convinced for the rest of his life that ruling England had always been his father's intention for him. Richard, however, had finally had enough. He launched another military uprising, once again receiving support from France, where Philip Augustus now sat on the throne. This time, Henry was old and ailing, while Richard had grown into a skilled military leader. He emerged victorious, forcing his father to officially declare him his heir. Yet even in defeat, Henry remained defiant. According to accounts, he looked Richard in the eye and declared,
"I pray that I will live long enough to take revenge on you."
He didn't. Henry, King of England, died at Chinon Castle on July 6th, 1189. Richard was immediately notified and instructed to have his mother released at once. However, upon arriving in England, Richard realized that this instruction was unnecessary. Eleanor was released immediately after Henry's death and recognized as regent until Richard's arrival. There was no formal decree, but Eleanor's authority was sufficient in the matter. In the years that followed, Eleanor frequently acted as regent. In some instances, Richard officially appointed her, but often her position was simply due to her status as Eleanor of Aquitaine. For the first time, chroniclers began to describe her positively for her work during this period. Much work awaited mother and son. The Third Crusade was approaching, and Richard wanted to join it. Eleanor supported his decision. Originally, she was supposed to stay behind as regent. However, she had already found a suitable wife for Richard in Berengaria of Navarre and wanted them married before the crusade began. Ideally, Richard would father an heir before embarking on the dangers of war. Eleanor traveled to Italy with Berengaria to intercept Richard, but the marriage could only be completed after Richard's capture of Cyprus. During this time, William de Longchamp, Richard's justiciar, was appointed to act as regent. Meanwhile, John used the opportunity to advance his own claims. Tensions escalated between the two men. Eleanor received urgent letters calling her back to England. Richard decided that his mother, along with Walter de Coutances, the Archbishop of Rouen, should work together to restore order. They succeeded to some extent, but John remained defiant. Although he had sworn an oath to Richard not to return to England until 1193, Longchamp was authorized to release him from this promise if necessary. Richard had also appointed Arthur as his heir, until he had a son of his own. But John not only returned to England, he was paid homage as Richard's heir. Longchamp resigned his posts, and Eleanor did nothing to prevent this. John saw his position as confirmed and even sought to take the throne. In 1191, he informed the barons that Richard had fallen during the Crusade. However, the rebellion failed because the barons did not believe him. Meanwhile, Richard had fallen out with French King Philip, who had returned to France and openly supported John during the Crusade. This alienated some of the barons, who saw John as a traitor, forcing him to flee England for a few months to save his life. There were many fires for Eleanor to try to extinguish, but she was unable to manage them all. Then matters worsened. On his way home, Richard was captured by Emperor Henry VI of Germany. The ransom for his release was set at a staggering 100,000 silver marks. Richard offered John a chance for forgiveness if he would pay half of this sum. Eleanor herself raised much of the money in England and personally escorted it to Germany to secure her son's freedom. The anger surrounding Richard's captivity was immense. Eleanor had written several letters to the Pope, pleading for intervention, but received no response. One of these letters read,
"Pitiful and pitied by no one, why have I come to the ignominy of this detestable old age, who was ruler of 2 kingdoms, mother of 2 kings? My guts are torn from me, my family is carried off, and removed from me. The young king and the Count of Brittany sleep in dust, and their most unhappy mother is compelled to be irremediably tormented by the memory of the dead. 2 sons remain to my solace, who today survive to punish me, miserable and condemned. King Richard is held in chains, in captivity with Emperor Henry VI of Germany. His brother John depletes his kingdom with iron, and lays it waste with fire. In all things, the Lord has turned cruel to me and attacked me with the harshness of his hand. Truly his wrath battles against me. My sons fight amongst themselves. If it is a fight where one is restrained in chains, the other, adding sorrow to sorrow, undertakes to usurp the kingdom of the exile by cruel tyranny. Good Jesus, who will grant that you protect me in hell, and hide me until your fury passes, until the arrows which are in me cease, by which my whole spirit is sucked out.
In Spire, however, a shocking revelation awaited them. John had betrayed Richard once again. He and Philip had offered Emperor Henry a higher ransom to prevent Richard's release, and the emperor was inclined to accept their offer. Ultimately, it was the emperor's own princes who pressured him to honor his word, and Richard was released once the ransom was paid. The king and his mother returned to England, where they were received with great celebration. John formally submitted to Richard in a ceremony, and Richard was crowned again. However, the empire had been economically ruined by the ransom. Richard sought to resolve this issue by plundering his enemies' lands in France. During one such campaign, Richard was struck by a crossbow bolt, which led to a fatal wound. He died from this injury in the arms of his mother, who had never left his side since his release. Eleanor knew that time had become a critical factor. Arthur was the rightful heir, and it was clear to everyone that John would eventually claim the throne. John was also in France, where Arthur, under the protection and control of the French king, would attempt to arrest him with his ally. This confrontation could spell the end of the empire that Eleanor and Henry II had built. To prevent this, Eleanor sent word to John, urging him to flee France. She also officially appointed him as the successor to her lands in France, giving her blessing for him to claim the English crown. The barons followed her recommendation and made him king. Eleanor, now well over 70, not only traveled frequently between England and France, but also organized the defense of her continental possessions. In command, she withstood French attacks. Despite her age, she had not truly retired. She had taken refuge at Fontevraud Abbey, but her duties remained. The battle for Mirebeau Castle became particularly significant. In July 1202, Arthur succeeded in surrounding the fortress with his forces. This was where a personal confrontation between grandmother and grandson occurred. Arthur approached Eleanor and said,
"Madam, I have the highest respect for you. I ask you to surrender the castle to me and leave peacefully."
Eleanor replied,
A true gentleman would never attack the castle where his grandmother is. I ask that you wage your war elsewhere. There are plenty of castles in the area for you to attack.
Although Arthur managed to breach the outer defensive bulwarks, Eleanor held her ground until John arrived with his army, lifting the siege. Arthur was taken captive. Every victory John achieved on the continent was, in fact, due to his mother's efforts. She had even arranged a suitable marriage for him before once again retreating to the convent, where she passed away in 1204. She was buried beside her second husband. Unfortunately, Eleanor's bones are no longer there. During the French Revolution, the abbey was plundered, and the graves of Eleanor, Henry, and Richard, among others, were desecrated. Their remains were scattered across France, and they are likely lost forever. This fate serves as a fitting metaphor for Eleanor's life. What we know of her is often distorted by hostile accounts. Her grave may exist, but the true essence of who she was as a person has been obscured. For example, Eleanor was probably the most powerful woman in English medieval history, but she was far from the only one. She rebelled against her husband, but she was not alone in that. Henry I's wife, for instance, once attempted to shoot him with a crossbow. Even Eleanor did not go that far. In the Victorian era, Eleanor became a projection of idealized values, heavily romanticized and stripped of her flaws. Her mistakes were swept under the rug to protect this idealized image, and to this day, this distorted portrayal persists. Eleanor's name is often invoked in discussions of feminist role models, but throughout her life she showed no particular interest in advancing women's rights. She was focused on her own circumstances, and given the scarce knowledge we have of her life, much of which was shaped by male chroniclers who resented her, it's easy to impose such an interpretation. The label Grandmother of Europe also aligns with this narrative. Eleanor, in truth, had little interest in such a title. Her primary concern was the protection of her family. Perhaps it is best to leave it at that. Eleanor was a woman who fought fiercely for herself and her children until her last breath, and in doing so, she outshone everyone else. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe.